Greetings everyone. Welcome to the ongoing series on making of contemporary India. Today's topic of discussion would be non-alignment. We all know that after independence there were several changes that were going to take place in Indian polity, economy, and the way foreign policy was to be devised had to be completely different from the way it had been followed during the colonial period. Foreign policies reflect the orientation of a nation towards the rest of the world. The goals, means, attitudes, and approaches are the decisive ingredient for the formulation of the foreign policy. After India achieved the status of a sovereign state in 1947, it really needed a policy like non-aligned movement to ensure its sovereignty in the world anarchy. A country's foreign policy consists of self-interest strategies chosen by the state to safeguard its national interests and to achieve its goals within international relations milieu. The relationship between non-alignment as the most distinctive feature of Indian foreign policy thinking during the Cold War and India's interest in helping form the non-aligned movement are some very key topics which can be understood with reference to the 1950s and 1960s. Precisely because of the early success of its independent, non-aligned policy, India's decision to join and help shape the non-aligned movement also needs some explaining. Foreign policy dictates how a country will act with respect to other countries, politically, socially, economically, as well as militarily, and to a somewhat extent how it behaves towards non-state actors. So, foreign policy can also be known as international relations policy or simply diplomacy. Many thinkers in the field put the genesis of modern foreign policy and statesmanship with Richelieu, a statesman in France. Richelieu became famous for consolidating French power, making France among the first of the great powers and feuding with the strong states like the Habsburgs, which ruled in both Austria and Spain. Foreign policies are the strategies that are used by governments to guide their actions in the international arena, that is, away from the domestic sphere. The tangible determinants of foreign policy remain constant over a long period of time. The scope of policy alteration tends to be limited. However, we cannot say that the foreign policy cannot be changed at all. Extremely cautious in initiating a sudden change in foreign policy is needed most of the times, but rare changes do occur from time to time depending on the changing world climate. With the disintegration of the European colonial system after the Second World War, many things appeared on the international horizon that changed the nature, style, as well as strategies of international relations, and the impact was felt on India also. Several changes, as I just mentioned, like the emergence of new nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, brought about a drastic change that the nature of international relations underwent significant transformation in terms of its content as well as style. The principle of non-alignment was accepted by the Congress at Haripura session. Even our culture and philosophy preaches that what we refer to today as non-alignment. And this old Indian philosophy was asserted by Mahatma Gandhi when he advocated that India should be friendly to all and enemy to none. In the post-World War scenario, two major superpowers emerged, and their mutual rivalry resulted in the creation of two hostile military blocs, and soon a race started among nations as to which bloc they were going to join. So, an atmosphere of tension, distrust, and fear developed between not only the two power blocs but also among the various nations. And this entire scenario came to be described as the Cold War. As many former imperialist colonies were gaining independence, both the blocs tried to draw these new independent nations into their respective blocs by offering them several things, and also by sometimes intimidating them. So, if we talk about the post-Second World War scenario, the ones who were joining the blocs were given economic and military aid and were expected to provide military and political support in return in case a conflict emerged in near future. So, it was clearly a give and take. India did not wish to ally itself with either party because it was aware of the high price of military involvement, and also it wanted to cherish the newfound freedom which would have become meaningless if it would have again come under impact of any particular power bloc, whether it was USA or USSR. Therefore, it tried to initiate a movement for world peace independently. When we talk about non-aligned movement, it is important to outline as to what are the implications of such a thought process. It definitely means healthy cooperation amongst nations so that the benefit can be shared by all. And this policy, which was supported by several newly emerging independent nations, came to be defined as the non-aligned movement. It meant basically an impartial approach towards world issues without being influenced by either bloc. Non-alignment, however, does not mean being neutral or not involved in foreign affairs, because this again is a wrong notion that is usually associated with the policy of non-alignment, as if it means that the country is neutral. It, on the other hand, means remaining apart from military and political groups while taking an active part in promoting world peace and also promoting understanding among nations. Non-alignment has its political, economic and social roots in the anti-colonial struggles of the era of post-World War. It can be described as a movement which aimed at bringing in a new international order in which the states should not be discriminated against because of their history, because of their social origin, their small size, different backgrounds, traditions, and perceptions of themselves and their interests. It means a policy which incorporates an idea that it is important to be friendly with all, but only on an equal footing and reciprocity, and not to be hooked to any specific power bloc. This movement became an important forum for several countries that did not want to support either bloc but wished to work for the cause of peace and cooperation among different nations. So, the whole story of non-alignment from Belgrade Conference indicates the resolve of the new nations in reshaping an international order. If we talk about the origins of the movement, one can trace its origins in the Asia-Africa Conference that was held in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955. The meeting was convened upon the invitation of the Prime Ministers of Burma, Ceylon, India, Indonesia and Pakistan, and brought together leaders of mostly former colonies from the two continents of Africa and Asia to discuss some common concerns as well as to develop joint policies in international relations. The first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, then President Sukarno of Indonesia, and the Egyptian President Samal Abdul Nasir led the conference and later on the movement also. At the meeting, Third World leaders shared their similar problems of resisting the pressures of the major powers, maintaining their independence and opposing colonialism as well as neo-colonialism, which was emerging especially in the form of Western domination. So, as I just indicated, that non-alignment does not mean neutrality. In fact, neutrality is an attitude of non-participation or refusal to take sides on any issue irrespective of its merits. Alignment is an attitude of openly declaring in advance that the country will be on the side of another country aligned with it irrespective of the merits of the case. So, therefore, non-alignment meant keeping one's options open. And it means that a country would not decide in advance whether to support a specific cause or not. A non-aligned country will judge each case as it arises on its merits and demerits, and it sees it and not as others see it. So, therefore, as one can say that non-alignment implied a concept of liberty and freedom at state level. Neutrality is a concept relevant only in times of war. Neutrality means to keep aloof from war. Non-alignment, on the other hand, is a concept relevant both during peace as well as war. Non-alignment has thus very little to do with neutrality or partiality. Neutrality imposes certain limitations and confers some rights, and hence it was very important to mention the term non-alignment. A neutral country has to prove in practice its neutrality in war. Non-alignment, on the other hand, believes in furthering one's own interest in the light of the prevailing circumstances according to one's independent judgment, both during peace as well as war. Another very important aspect associated with non-alignment is that it is not something like a dogma or a rigid ideology. It is not fixed or a static philosophy. Rather, it is dynamic and adjusts itself to changing circumstances, to the emerging reality, and it also reconciles between the interests of one's own country and that of the countries of the world. Non-alignment does not favor intervention, but non-alignment states sometimes do interfere in the internal affairs of others, as India did with respect to Nepal, Bhutan, etc. The aid given by India to Burma during the civil war was nothing short of interference in the internal affairs of Burma, but then the condition needed that. So, therefore, instead of focusing only on the issue of non-interference, a more practical approach was adopted. The opposition of India to the acceptance of arms assistance by Pakistan from other countries is another example to show India's interference into the policies or the internal affairs of Pakistan. But again, India has a right to do so in order to preserve its own interest. Now, a very important beginning was made at the Bandung Conference, which was a conference of Asian African leaders in 1955, where 29 Asian and African countries identified themselves as neutral, and they adopted a 10-point declaration on the promotion of world peace and cooperation based on the UN Charter and the 5 principles of Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. And finally, the non-aligned movement took shape in 1961. 5 founding members of NAM were Nehru from India, Tito of Yugoslavia, Nasser of Egypt, Nkrumah of Ghana, and Sukarno of Indonesia. Now, neutrality was not specific to the Cold War, and over 100 states were involved in this movement throughout the 20th century. As you can see, this very important visual associated with non-alignment. Now, if we talk about non-alignment in Europe, and one can say that almost no European countries were non-aligned, as the Iron Curtain and the spheres of influence were centered in Europe. However, Yugoslavia, after rejecting Soviet influence and being expelled from Comintern, Tito's Yugoslavia began receiving aid from the West. However, after Stalin's death, Tito realized that he would have to choose between allying with the West and giving up his single-party dictatorship or reconciling with Khrushchev. Neither choice appealed to Tito, so he became a founder of the non-aligned movement as an alternative to joining either of the two powers. This is a file photo of Tito, as you can see on the screen, who can be seen as the harbinger of non-alignment in Europe. And if we talk about non-alignment in Asia, then most of Asia was represented at the Bandung Conference, and being one of the key organizers of the Bandung Conference, Indian leader Jawaharlal Nehru emerged as a non-alignment leader. Indonesia and Malaysia also emerged as important countries who had championed the cause of NAM. Asia, along with other non-aligned movement countries, tried to shift the global political agenda away from the Cold War to the needs of the poorer countries. After independence, India's relations with the United States diminished substantially. India rejected US capitalism and created a series of 5-year plans with a very small private sector. This again was the need of the hour, because after independence, there was a need to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and also to incorporate the principles of a welfare state in policy making. As a result of the economic disputes between India and the US, India refused to join the US alliance in the Cold War. Because India did not fully support the Soviet Union either, India became an organizer of the Bandung Conference. If we talk about the important objectives of this conference, then there were 5 very important objectives that were stated. like peace and disarmament, right to self-determination, the aspect of economic equality, cultural equality, multilateralism through the strong support of UN. Then another very important concept that needs to be discussed is the idea of third world country. The term third world country was created during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, a third world country referred to a country that was part of the non-alignment movement. Many Asian countries were labeled third world countries because of their political position during the Cold War. So during the 1960s and 1970s, countries who were part of the third world used their majority vote in the United Nations to shift discussions and attention away from the Cold War and to the specific needs and requirements of their country. In this visual, you can see a map of NAM countries in 2019. As colonial empires disappeared, newly independent states that gained nationhood after World War II still found themselves economically dependent on the industrialized, wealthier Western states and were caught between the tensions of great superpower rivalry. The conclusion of the Second World War in 1945 brought neither peace nor actual war, but almost continuous international crisis as the East and the West struggled for taking advantage in the Cold War. Some emerging states in Africa and Asia were especially sensitive to the dangers of neocolonialism, made possible by the necessary importation of business managers, technicians, dependence upon imported military supplies, and reliance upon set patterns of trade and outside sources of investment. Very closely tied with the fear of neocolonialism was the determination of third world nations to avoid becoming pawns in the East-West competition. The economic needs of the third world states made them quite vulnerable to foreign influences and pressures. Much required resources for economic development came through economic ties and trade with United States and the Soviet Union, which blamed each other to capture the political support of the newly independent countries. To support developmental projects, governments sought loans and technical assistance from the superpowers, many of which were their former colonial overlords. So, it is in this background that the non-alignment held that peaceful coexistence with the great powers was both possible as well as preferable. India's Jawaharlal Nehru saw neutralism as a means of forging a third force among non-aligned nations, and the Egyptian leader Abdel Nasser maneuvered between the superpowers in pursuit of his goals. So the most famous third world meeting, the Bandung Conference of African and Asian nations in 1955, pragmatically discussed mutual interests and strategies, which ultimately led to the establishment of the non-aligned movement in 1961. Thank you.